And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author is Dr. Patrick Kenny, and the book is To Raise the Fallen, a selection of the war, letters, prayers, and spiritual writings of Father Willie Doyle, S.J., published by Ignatius, available through our EWTN Religious Catalog. Welcome to Bookmark.
Thank you very much.
It's nice to have you here, Dr. Kenny. It's interesting, too, because with Father Willie Doyle, S.J., the reason I was very interested in doing this interview was because of the wonderful documentary that you participated in that we produced on him, Bravery Under Fire. So it was great to see you be able to come and be on Father Mitch's show back in the fall as a guest talking about this book.
Correct. I'm delighted to be here and delighted for the interest that EWTN has in the life of Father Willie, and it's a great docudrama that EWTN has produced.
Right. Now, this is To Raise the Fallen, compiled and edited by Patrick Kenny. That's you. It's not really a biography, and from reading your book, there seems like there's at least 2 to 3 biographies that are out there already. How did you decide to make this different?
So this book is a bit different because it's Father Willie telling his story in his own words, and one of the many qualities that Father Doyle had is that he was a fascinating writer, very, very skilled writer. He had, I suppose, some of the skill of the Irish in storytelling. And we have many, many, many letters that he wrote home to his father from the war. And in that sense, he's a very valuable first-hand witness, first-hand account of what happened in the war. And he tells his story in a way that no one else really could.
Now, you teach business, strategic planning. You've got a website on Father Willie Doyle. How did that come about?
That came about, I suppose, because I read the original biography written by Alfred O'Rahilly in the 1920s, and that was a blockbuster biography in its time. It was translated into all the major European languages and ran through multiple editions. Several saints read it and were inspired by him.
You mentioned that, right?
Yeah. So Mother Teresa and Saint Jose Maria Escriva and so on. And a friend recommended that I read that book, and when I read the book, I have to say I was absolutely mesmerised and blown away by the heroism of this man. And in fact, I'm from a town that's about 2 miles away from where Father Doyle grew up and lived, and I had never heard of him before, and I felt that there was a great injustice in the fact that somebody so heroic and so holy wasn't more well known. And through a variety of circumstances, I set up a blog with daily quotes from his writings, and it's taken off from there.
Now, is his writings public knowledge, or was this something you had to acquire from the church or from his family? Or?
Okay, so both. I mean, there's a lot of his writings in the public domain, but some of the prayers and so on in this book haven't been in the public domain before.
Okay, so they're original to your work here. Now, in the introduction, you say, in May 1893, an unknown Irish Jesuit novice using the devotional language of the era wrote the following contract in his private diary: Darling Mother Mary, in preparation for the glorious martyrdom, which I feel assured thou art going to obtain for me, I, thy most unworthy child. So he always had in his mind that he was going to be martyred for the faith?
That's right, yeah. I mean, he read books about martyrs as a child. In fact, many other saints did that. St. Teresa of Avila, St. Catherine of Siena were also very inspired by the lives of the martyrs, and so was Father Doyle. So he had this desire to give himself fully, and there's no way that you can give yourself more fully to Jesus and to the faith than literally to lay down your life. Now,
he died what you call a martyr of charity, struck by a German shell when he ran into no man's land, August 16, 1917, so about a year before the war actually ended. What's a martyr of charity?
So traditionally we understand a martyr to be somebody who dies for the faith. There's also another category of people who die out of charity. They die because they are offering their lives to save others. We see examples of that, for instance, with St. Maximilian Kolbe, who died in order to save a father of a family from being executed by the Nazis. We see it with St. Damien of Molokai, who died because he was helping lepers. We see it with Father Doyle, who died while rescuing wounded soldiers.
Right, but knowing that it was his faith that made him do those things,
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, he was willing to put his life on the line, not just out of some great sense of adventure, but because he literally, I mean, he says when he volunteered for the war, he was willing to do it because he wanted to suffer for Christ.
As you make it clear, it's not just Catholics he was worried about too.
Absolutely everyone, not just Catholics, but also Protestants, and they had a tremendous love for him, and they really mourned him when he was killed. but also the enemy, the Germans. He looked after German prisoners, wounded German soldiers, and so on, and gave them the same love and affection and care that he gave to his own men.
It sounded like he had a lot of rats. He kept as sort of pets there.
Yeah, he talks about the rats and the fleas and the flies. He says, you know, you'd be eating some bread with jam on it, and the flies will eat the jam before it gets in your mouth. Woken up at night with rats crawling across his face. So
he was talking about his Christmas pudding.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, a fascinating story of Christmas pudding where his sister-in-law sent it to him. He put it aside in the dugout, and he wrote a letter back home saying, "I hope I don't die. I really want to have this pudding." And the rats ate it before he got to it. He ate the scraps that were left over, though. So.
That's right. In reverse of what usually happens.
That's right.
But,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now he was 4 of 7 children. Well, there were 4 of the 7 children in his family, I should say, who pursued religious vocations. Now his Fred became a Jesuit. He was the older brother. He ended up dying, right? Is he the one who died?
Yes.
And then there was Mary, who became a Sister of Mercy, and Charlie, who was just a few years older than Willie, also became a Jesuit. How did his brother die, and how did that impact him, do you think?
His brother that died wasn't a Jesuit. He was entered to diocesan priesthood for the Dublin diocese, and he was studying in Rome, and he got a fever and died 10 days before his ordination.
He initially entered the Jesuits and then became a diocesan priest.
And so 10 days before his ordination, he died, and there was a sense in which Willie felt he should take his place as a priest and step into that in order to make up for the loss of his brother. But I mean, he also had a really genuine vocation himself, but that loss of his brother did impact upon him. Right.
Now, what is it? There's 2 things you mentioned. You talk about his father's prestigious work ethic being transferred to him, and you also talk about the family being deeply religious. Do you think those are the 2 things that combined to make him into who he was?
I think so. I mean, he had a very, very good formation as a child. The family prayed together. They would, meditate on the imitation of Christ at breakfast time. They were renowned for their charity towards the poor in the area. So he had that good formation. His family were very supportive of the vocations within the family. And he loved his father, in particular loved his mother as well, but particularly his father. His mother had died by the time he went to war, but these letters he wrote home primarily were to his father. He signs to him, "Your loving son, Willie." He had this great affection for his father. And in fact, you can see that he introduces humour and interesting anecdotes in the war letters in the midst of all the gore and the death, in a sense almost to cheer up his father and to give his father hope, because obviously his father was worried about him.
Right. Now, I thought this was interesting. You talk about when Charlie and Willie were young, when they used to give coins to the poor, they would polish them up before they gave them to them.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting move. Some people might think, why would you waste your time? Money is money, you just spend it. But I think they had a sense that by giving a brand new coin, that they were adding an extra dignity to that gift and giving a respect to that person who was coming and begging.
Where did he get his fascination with the military? Where did that come from?
They played soldiers as a boy, so maybe it was just a boyhood, desire for adventure. Himself and his brother loved getting up to mischief and playing soldier games.
Now, he would have been considered, what, a middle-class family or an upper middle class? Because they had servants. Because you tell in here about the fact that as a young boy, he regularly helped the servants around the house, sometimes getting up early to light the fire, clean the dishes before they got up. And you talk about this sacrifice of his first ever shilling. Why don't you tell that story?
Yeah, so he got this shilling, which was a lot of money back then for a boy of that age, just over 100 years ago. And his older brother Charlie, who wrote one of the older biographies about him, actually describes how he was going down towards the local pastry shop, and he had this shilling in his hand, thinking about all the pastries and cakes he could get, and he met a beggar, and the beggar was looking for money, and there was a struggle between will I go and get those sweets and pastries, or will I give the money? And he gave the money, and it's described as grace and nature fighting, and grace won the day. So Willie apparently was on his way to his uncle's house after that, and he cried all the way to his uncle's house. The other part of the story I didn't tell there was that his uncle gave him more money to compensate him, so he actually made a profit out of his charity.
But it just goes to show that generosity is what we're called for. It doesn't make it easy.
That's right.
Or that it makes us happy when we do it. You also say he regularly won academic prizes, but really excelled at sports, cricket and soccer. Then you go say that he also had delicate health, and you talk about later where a situation where there was a fire, I think, and he actually had like a nervous breakdown of a thing.
Yes.
So how does having delicate health and being good at sports fit together?
I think he was highly strung. His delicate health was something to do with his stomach. I'm not quite sure what exactly that was. It was a digestive complaint. And he had that throughout his life, including even in the trenches, which adds to the horror of that time in the trenches for him. But nonetheless, he was big and strong, really into sports. But yeah, that fire in the novitiate building had an impact on him. He almost had to leave the Jesuits as a result. And that's a great thing about his story, because you see this transformation to being a rock of strength and courage in the middle of the war, despite what happened to him earlier.
Right. Now, he was ordained in '07, and he was involved with preaching missions. And you say, in the words of Pope Francis, he often went to the peripheries to seek those alienated from the church. He seemed to have a special gift for connecting with disaffected or wounded souls.
Yes. I mean, there are several stories that he writes about himself in his letters. About people who've been away from the church for many years. When he was giving a mission in a town, he would go and visit their houses. Sometimes he'd be rebuffed, almost with violence, and told not to come back. But he'd persist, and he'd find some commonality with them in terms of their work or their background. And he says he never met anybody on a mission that he wasn't able to bring back to the church.
Well, he has this thing, in my wanderings through the slums, I came across by accident an old woman over 90 who had not entered a church for long, long years. I have led a wicked life, she said, but every day I ask God to send me a good friend before I died, and I feel now my prayer is heard. Yeah,
that was in his first year as a priest, and he comments on that saying, all the sacrifices that I've made and that my family have made for me to become a priest are worth it because of what I've been able to do for that lady.
You say at a time when holiness was often seen as preserve of priests and nuns, he understood the importance of reaching ordinary people in ordinary lay people as far as their holiness, and the idea of residential retreats. I thought this was interesting. For lay people, seems commonplace to us now, which it does, but it was a novelty 100 years ago.
Yeah, and that's surprising because, you know, priests and nuns had retreats, and maybe some of the very wealthiest people had residential retreats, but the ordinary working person typically didn't get to go on a retreat. So Father Willie was very concerned about them. He was concerned about what he saw happening to workers across Europe in terms of the spread of socialism and communist ideas at the time. And he really wanted to support these workers in their faith. So he fought a hard battle to get a retreat house for working men.
But why did the suffragettes decide to burn that building down?
I have no idea. I think it was completely disconnected. The Jesuits bought a building. He was ready to go and be the director of it, and for some reason the suffragettes burned it down. I think it was totally unconnected, but one of those acts of fate. Right.
Now, he had a sense about going and working possibly in Africa too, right?
Yes. He wanted to be a missionary. He always wanted to do the hardest thing. Okay, he didn't want to take life easy. And he felt that going to the Congo as a missionary was a hard thing he was maybe asked to do. And he actually went so far as to learn the local language, and there are still notebooks to this day where he's translating into the local dialects and languages articles of the faith and prayers and catechisms.
Right, the Congo, right?
That's right, yeah, but he wasn't sent in the end.
Right. Now, he was a bit of a prankster, wasn't he?
That's right, yeah. He loved practical jokes and tricks, and that's one of the great things. You know, you have this man of intense prayer and asceticism, this hero in the war, and yet a very lovable human person who was always telling jokes and a source of mirth and fun for everyone around him.
Why do you think he volunteered for the front?
I think he volunteered because he wanted to be with those working men. He also wanted to save souls, and he knew that this was a place, a periphery, where people's souls were at risk. I mean, people are dying there, and they need the help of a priest when they're dying. But also because he knew it was a hard life, and he knew he'd suffer, and he wanted to suffer for God.
Now, Father Doyle then held the rank of captain once he was a chap. As one Protestant officer noted, Father Doyle never rests night and day, he's with us.
Yeah, so as a captain, he could have availed of various privileges. And one of the key things about his ministry as a chaplain is that he didn't avail of those. He was with the men at every opportunity he could get. He didn't take advantage of any.
Right, again, you kind of refer to Pope Francis, the idea of he smelled of sheep.
Yeah,
in that
probably
way.
Literally in a sense when you're living in the trenches with them.
Right, absolutely. Now, you mentioned he's a dedicated letter writer, as you can see by reading this book, and the letters were written to his father. What kind of insights did you get into him, or did you have additional insights into him when you started going through his letters?
I suppose the insight you get ultimately is that this is a man who is generous, and I would say that is his number one characteristic. Generosity is evident in his life at every single moment, from his youth as a child looking after the poor right up to his death in the war. And it's that generosity that gave him courage, it's that generosity that spurred on his prayer and his personal mortifications.
Right. And he fought the Battle of the Somme, which obviously a well-known battle people know about, and 1 million pounds of explosives blowing up at Messini's Ridge. I don't know how it's pronounced.
Messine Ridge.
Messine Ridge. one of those. And he won nominated for both Distinguished Service Order and Victoria Cross. Neither of those were granted, though he got other awards. And you have some sense that maybe because he was Catholic, he may not have gotten those awards.
There's some controversy about that. There's some people who believe it's because he was a Catholic chaplain, others aren't so sure. But people who knew him said he deserved a Victoria Cross and were surprised that he didn't get it.
Right. You describe him to be a spiritual tactician of the highest order.
Yes.
What does that mean?
So that means that he was a man who wanted to be holy, and he took advantage of every spiritual tool and tactic that he could find in the traditional Jesuit mode in order to reach that level of holiness. So that meant for him doing the hard thing, so this Jesuit idea of agere contra, acting against himself. So he would look and see what were his biggest defects, and he would find ways to act against them. But he did it in a very methodical way. So he kept meticulous diaries where he'd note his successes and his failures in the spiritual life with a view to improving the next day. So kind of like somebody today might have an app to help them work out in their fitness.
Right.
He was doing the same with a pen and paper in his spiritual fitness.
Right. The priesthood has lost some of the esteem in which it was once held in Ireland and elsewhere, unfortunately. That is precisely why Father Doyle's witness is needed now more than ever, and why the time may have come to consider his cause for beatification once again, which was opened a long time ago. And obviously you even mentioned, as I think you did on Father Mitch's show as well, about the that within a dozen years of his death, the Jesuits had received more than 6,000 reports of alleged favors through his intercession.
That's right. Yeah, I mean that's incredible when you consider the era that they were living in, and that this devotion to him was global, literally from everywhere in the world. I mean, there are almost 2,000 letters from the United States, from every single state.
Now, and then you move into the letters of the, from the front, which is from late 1915 till August of 1917, which is the last one 2 days before he died. Yes. Now, you presented them chronologically, which makes a lot of sense, I guess. At the same time, in reading through from the beginning to the end, do you see a change in him at all in how he relates the stories or what he's going through?
I think he becomes more and more generous as he goes through. Father Doyle did a lot of mortifications in his earlier life, and you see towards the end of his life, he's still doing mortifications and penances, but a lot of it is accepting what's happening to him, the sufferings, the pains, the rats, the vermin, the scrapes with death. So you see this gradual self-emptying, almost becoming more passive. He's accepting what's happening to him. And there's an interesting one where you see it even right up to the end. His dominant defect was impatience. He was very zealous, a very forceful character. And in order to fight that and become more humble, he decided that he would make himself the slave of the orderly or the servant that he had as a captain. So if the orderly didn't make his dinner on time, he didn't eat dinner. If his orderly made tea in water that corpses had been in, which happened on more than one occasion, he drank that tea. So he made himself the slave of his servant in order to fight against that self-will that he had within himself. So you see this self-emptying going to, I would say, heroic levels.
Right. Now, he survived a gas attack in April 27th of 1916, mustard gas, and he kind of talked about it and then later tells that he didn't tell the whole story the first time.
Correct, right? Yeah, so he almost died in that attack because, well, he was helping other soldiers who had been wounded. And so the way he was breathing and the exertion he was putting in, and the fact that the gas hung around the bottom of the trenches under the boards there. So when he was bending down to help the soldiers, he was breathing in gas, and he didn't realize it. Small amounts of gas, not big amounts, and that over time undermined him, and he got very, very sick. But that's a sign of his cheerfulness and his love for his father, because when he wrote the letter home first, he didn't tell his father how serious it was.
Right.
And it was a year later when he wrote back and said, by the way, I never told you I almost died last year.
Right, and he also talks about a narrow escape in June 1916 and refers to the Germans as Brother Fritz. I thought that was
That's right, yeah, he has lots of interesting nicknames.
He says, my escape was nothing short of a miracle. From a moment before I was standing on the very spot where the shell fell, and I had just moved away a couple of paces. I do not think it was possible for one to be so near a high explosive and not be killed.
Yeah, he had numerous scrapes. I mean, I think he ultimately believed he would survive the war because he'd survived so many close scrapes with death. And that's one of the reasons why the soldiers loved him. They thought he was absolutely protected. So in really difficult circumstances, the soldiers would see, where is Father Doyle? And they would go and be near him because they thought they'd be safe with him.
Right, like I say, August 14, 1917, in the letter, I've told you all my escapes, dearest Father, because I think what I have written will give you the same confidence which I feel that my old armchair up in heaven is not ready yet, and I do not want you to be uneasy about me. That was 2 days before he was killed.
That's right, yeah. And it's really tragic reading that, saying, you know, he's reassuring his father, and he was probably dead by the time his father received that letter.
Right. And saying here that Father Doyle's notebooks were never intended to be read by others. He left a written request asking that it be destroyed in case of his death. Where was that letter?
So this was in his room in the Jesuit house in Rathfarnham Castle in Dublin. So his brother Charlie, the other Jesuit brother, was cleaning out his room after he had died. He found these boxes, and he read the notes and private diaries and brought them to the superior and said, should we really destroy these? And they looked at it and said, no, they're too valuable.
Now, in the section on spiritual advice, you talk about, in addition to being a well-known preacher and retreat master, Father Doyle was regularly sought out for spiritual direction and advice. I thought this jumped right out at me because it relates so much to Mother Angelica. So, abandonment to divine providence.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what she always believed in EWTN. Abandon yourself completely into the hands of God and take directly from Him every event of life, agreeable or disagreeable. Only then can God make you really holy.
Absolutely, and I think we see that in the life of Father Doyle towards the end, where he's just accepting these horrors and pains that he's going through.
Right. Accepting ourselves, you must have, I thought this was interesting for somebody back in 1917, etc. Accepting ourselves, you must have great patience with yourself. Remember, God sees the intention.
So one of the things Father Doyle was famous for was a booklet that he wrote about scruples. So a lot of people suffer from scruples, maybe more 100 years ago than today, but it was an issue where people were worried that God isn't accepting of them. They were too much of a sinner. They were overly scrupulous.
Right.
Maybe the pendulum swings in the other direction at some other times in history. But Father Doyle was very concerned about people who were overly scrupulous. And he's saying, keep trying your best, keep beginning again, but be patient with yourself.
I'm not sure if people know what the word scruples means actually anymore.
Times change, times change.
Under God's will, holiness is really nothing more than perfect conformity to God's will, and every step in this direction must please Him immensely.
Yeah, so that's a traditional spirituality of the saints. Accept God's will, because that's where He wants you to be, and He'll make you holy in those circumstances.
Right. Now, he was very involved with vocations, right?
Correct,
and promoting vocations for the priesthood, right?
Hugely successful during his life. He wrote 2 best-selling pamphlets, Shall I Be a Priest and Vocations. And even during his life, he received letters from all around the world, from convents of nuns saying, we have recruits because of your letter, or priests who became priests because of it. And in the last few years, there was a Benedictine convent in the Isle of Wight that started a novena to Father Doyle for an Irish vocation. There aren't many Irish vocations to contemplative convents today. And on the last day of the novena, they were contacted by an Irish girl.
Really?
And she entered. So even today, I think Father Doyle is working for vocations.
Right. He also wrote meditations on Stations of the Cross. You also include his personal prayers. Is there any of his personal prayers that particularly struck you?
There's an interesting one there where he talks about never complaining. And he says, everyone complains except the saints. And if we accept the circumstance that we're in and don't complain about others or about what God is asking of us, then we'll become holy.
So the material that's in this book, was this a lot of material you already had on your website, etc., or how did you go about putting that material together?
Yeah, so there's a lot of that material on the website. So on fatherdoyle.com, I put a daily quote from his writings or some episode from his life on that particular date. So I had a lot of that material already, but there was a lot of sifting to do to come up with something that's accessible for people, to give a good introduction to Father Doyle, and to give, I suppose, a souvenir for people who already know and love him, because in this you have a collection of his personal prayers, some of them that have never been available in public before.
Right, and so somebody who might have read or could go and read the biography or even watch Bravery Under Fire, the wonderful documentary we did here, which you were featured in, as I mentioned earlier, what insights do you think they would get in this book that they wouldn't get from just reading a straight biography?
I think getting Father Doyle in his own words primarily. I mean, I have an introductory essay on his life, and I have a bit of an introduction to his spiritual life, but most of it is Father Doyle in his own words telling his own story. So in that sense, it's direct and it's accessible, and he's such a good writer, I don't think anybody can tell a story as well as him.
In reading as you read the biography, and now you've read through all this other materials, what insights do you think people today might have about him that people at the time maybe wouldn't have had?
I think something that stands out more now perhaps than 100 years ago is his desire to make reparation for the sins of priests. That's more acute for us today perhaps than it was 100 years ago. And in fact, the very last thing he wrote in his private diary 3 weeks before he died, was that he offered up all of his sufferings in the trenches in reparation for the sins of priests.
Right, right. So as far as a writer, how many books have you written?
This is the first one so far, but there's others I'm
You're thinking
kind
of
of
writing
working
some
on.
others?
Yes, yes.
In a business vein, in a religious
Well,
vein?
actually, in
or?
a business vein, but also in a religious vein. There's a lot of other people like Father Doyle whose causes either were opened and stalled or weren't opened, and I want to work on.
And how do you like to
biographies.
write when you write?
How do I sitting down and just writing and getting at it?
You do it on planes, on jets, anytime you get a chance?
Anytime I get a chance, but mainly at my desk at home.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Dr. Patrick Kenny, for joining us here on EWTN's Bookmark.
Okay, thank you very
so
much.
And the book, of course, is To Raise the Fallen, a selection of the war letters, prayers, and spiritual writings of Father Willie Doyle, S.J. Wonderful biography included in here with the wonderful letters, and of course our documentary as well, all available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. Check it out. Check us out next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark. Thanks for joining us.